Hey guys, tonight we walk into one of the most intimidating places in ancient history, northern Mesopotamia, somewhere around 3,000 years ago, where dust blows across wide brown plains and the distant hills look like the backs of sleeping giants. The sun is already warm, even though the day has barely started, and you're standing in a land that doesn't exactly scream easy living. This is the homeland of the Assyrians, people who will eventually build what many historians call the most feared empire of the ancient world. And honestly, you probably won't survive this. Not because the weather is terrible, though it absolutely is, and not because the rivers flood unpredictably, though they do that too. No, your chances are slim because the people around you are training constantly for war. And if you happen to belong to one of the neighboring kingdoms, well, let's just say the Assyrians are not famous for sending polite letters first. But before we get too deep into all that, a quick favor. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere interesting, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I always love seeing how far these nighttime history journeys travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin walking along a dusty path, leading toward a settlement built beside the Tigris River. The land here, in what is now northern Iraq, is harsher than the fertile southern plains where earlier civilizations like Sumer flourished. Crops grow, yes, but they require effort. Irrigation channels snake through the soil, and farmers watch the sky with the anxious patience of people who know drought is always a possibility. This tough environment shapes the people who live here. The early Assyrians start as a relatively small community, centered around one city, Ashur. The city is named after their chief god, also called Ashur, which already tells you something important. In this society, religion and politics are basically roommates who never stop talking to each other. Historians widely agree on one mainstream fact. The city of Ashur becomes an important trading hub around 2000 BCE. Merchants travel from here to distant places like Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, carrying textiles, tin, and silver. Clay tablets found by archaeologists record incredibly detailed business deals. Yes, even 4,000 years ago, people are arguing about invoices. You can almost imagine one tired merchant scratching a complaint onto a clay tablet. You promised the tin would arrive last month. Some things truly never change, but trade alone doesn't define Assyria for long. Geography plays a huge role here. Unlike southern Mesopotamia, which is relatively flat and open, northern Mesopotamia sits near mountains and strategic routes. Armies pass through. Rival kingdoms form. And survival starts depending on one thing above all else: military strength. By around 1400 BCE, Assyria begins shifting from a modest trading kingdom into something more aggressive. You notice it in the training grounds outside the settlement. Young men practice with spears and shields. Chariots rumble across open fields. Officers shout instructions, while soldiers move in disciplined formations. This is not a casual militia. This is the early version of what will eventually become one of the first truly professional armies in world history. And the kings of Assyria make sure everyone knows it. Royal inscriptions carved into stone proudly describe campaigns against neighboring territories. One king might boast that he crushed a rebellious city. Another brags about marching hundreds of miles to bring tribute back home. Historians still argue whether some of these accounts are exaggerated propaganda. Ancient kings were not exactly known for their humility. If an army captured one town, the inscription might describe it as conquering the entire universe. You can almost picture the royal scribe sighing quietly as the king dictates, "Write that we terrified the four corners of the world." "Yes, your majesty," the scribe says, gently pressing another wedge-shaped mark into wet clay. Still, even if the language is dramatic, the trend is clear. Assyria is becoming more militarized with every generation. And there's something else happening too. The god Ashur is slowly transforming in the Assyrian imagination. At first, he is simply the protective deity of the city. But over time, Assyrian kings begin describing him as a universal god, one who commands them to expand their rule. In other words, conquest becomes a divine mission. Imagine hearing your king announce that the gods themselves want you to invade the next kingdom over. That's a pretty powerful recruitment strategy. A quirky historical tidbit shows just how intertwined religion and warfare become. Assyrian kings sometimes carry sacred statues or symbols of the god Ashur into battle. It's like bringing the ultimate spiritual mascot onto the battlefield. Except the mascot can apparently order entire nations to surrender. Meanwhile, everyday life in Assyria continues alongside all this growing militarism. Farmers harvest barley and wheat. Craftsmen shape bronze tools and pottery. Families gather around hearth fires as the sun sets over the dusty plains. If you were an ordinary Assyrian citizen, your life might look surprisingly familiar. Work during the day, eat bread, onions, maybe some fish from the river. Try not to get drafted into the army if you prefer a quiet life. Although, statistically speaking, that plan probably won't work for long, because the kings are becoming increasingly ambitious. By the time the early Assyrian kingdoms evolve into what historians call the Middle Assyrian period, around the 14th century BCE, the rulers of Ashur are no longer satisfied with defending their territory. They want control of trade routes, farmland, and neighboring cities, and they are willing to fight for it. The soldiers you saw training earlier will soon march out across the region. Step by step, campaign by campaign, the Assyrians begin building the foundations of an empire. It won't happen overnight. Empires never do. But the process has already started, and the reputation of Assyrian kings is beginning to spread beyond their borders. Some people admire their discipline and strength. Others are absolutely terrified. And as you keep walking along the edge of this growing kingdom, watching the soldiers drilling under the hot Mesopotamian sun, you can already sense the direction history is moving. The Assyrians are about to become something the ancient world has rarely seen before, a war machine that never seems to stop marching. And this is only the beginning. The road eventually carries you closer to the heart of Assyrian power, towards the city whose name echoes through every prayer, command, and military oath, Ashur. From a distance, the city rises out of the brown landscape like a carefully stacked sculpture of mud brick and stone. Walls stretch along the horizon, thick and practical rather than decorative. This isn't a city trying to impress visitors with beauty. It's a city built to endure. As you approach the gates, you notice something interesting. Guards stand watch not just with spears and shields, but with an intensity that suggests this place isn't merely defended, it's sacred. Because it is. Ashur is more than the capital of a kingdom. It's the spiritual center of the Assyrian world. The city belongs to the god Ashur, and the king himself technically rules only as the god's earthly representative. In other words, the king doesn't exactly claim the throne as a personal possession. He governs it on behalf of a divine landlord, which sounds noble. Until you realize that if the god commands expansion, then resisting the king can look suspiciously like resisting the universe itself. You pass through the gate and step into streets alive with activity. Donkeys haul baskets of grain. Merchants argue politely over the price of wool. The air smells like bread baking somewhere nearby, mixed with the faint, dusty scent of clay tablets drying in the sun. This is the everyday side of Assyria that doesn't always appear in dramatic history documentaries. People are just living. Children run through narrow streets playing games. A potter shapes wet clay into bowls that will soon sit on someone's dinner table. Scribes carefully carve wedge-shaped cuneiform symbols into tablets, documenting everything from temple offerings to legal disputes. One mainstream historical fact stands out here. The Assyrians inherit the long Mesopotamian tradition of writing and administration. Their scribes use the same cuneiform system that had been evolving for nearly 2,000 years. You glance over a scribe's shoulder and notice a tablet recording a grain delivery to the temple. It lists numbers, names, and dates with bureaucratic precision. Ancient paperwork, essentially, which proves that no empire in history, no matter how fierce its reputation, can function without someone somewhere saying, "Excuse me, this form isn't properly stamped." But religion still dominates everything. At the center of the city rises the Temple of Ashur, a massive structure surrounded by courtyards and smaller shrines. Priests move through the complex in steady routines, offering sacrifices and reciting prayers that echo softly against the stone walls. To the Assyrians, Ashur is not just a god who protects the city. He is the divine force guiding the destiny of their entire civilization. And slowly, quietly, something fascinating happens in Assyrian belief. Ashur begins to absorb characteristics of other Mesopotamian gods. In earlier Mesopotamian traditions, powerful deities like Marduk of Babylon hold central positions in the divine hierarchy. But Assyrian kings start promoting Ashur as the ultimate authority among the gods. Historians still argue whether this was genuine religious evolution or simply political strategy. After all, if your city's god is the most powerful god in the universe, that makes your empire's expansion sound less like invasion and more like divine administration. Don't worry, the Assyrians might say. We're not conquering you. Our God is just reorganizing the neighborhood. Inside the temple courts, priests consult omens before major decisions. They study the movement of the stars, the behavior of animals, and even the shapes formed by oil dropped into water. Yes, ancient Mesopotamian fortune-telling can get extremely creative. One quirky historical tidbit comes from the practice of extispicy, the examination of animal livers to interpret messages from the gods. Priests would sacrifice sheep and then carefully study the patterns and markings on the liver. Imagine a royal advisor leaning over the organ and announcing, The liver suggests we should invade that city to the west. Ancient decision-making had a very organic quality. Still, these rituals carry enormous weight. Kings rarely launch military campaigns without consulting priests and diviners first. If the omens look unfavorable, even the most ambitious ruler might delay his plans. Although, knowing ambitious kings, they probably keep checking until the liver eventually says yes. Beyond religion and administration, the city also functions as a military headquarters. You notice soldiers everywhere. They patrol the streets, guard storehouses, and escort royal officials through crowded markets. Their equipment is impressive: bronze helmets, shields reinforced with leather, and weapons carefully maintained by skilled metalworkers. Military service is not just common, it's expected. Assyrian society organizes itself partly around warfare. Landowners may owe military duty to the crown. Captured prisoners sometimes become laborers, helping construct walls, canals, and fortifications. And slowly, over generations, the Assyrian state becomes extremely good at organizing people. This may not sound dramatic, but it's actually one of the most powerful tools an empire can possess. Because armies don't run on bravery alone. They run on logistics. Food must be stored. Weapons must be produced. Roads must be maintained. Messages must travel between cities quickly. The Assyrians develop a surprisingly efficient administrative system to handle all of this. Officials track resources with obsessive attention to detail. If one village owes grain to the state, someone is definitely counting the sacks and probably writing it down twice. This combination, religious authority, military discipline, and organized bureaucracy, turns Ashur into something more than a city. It becomes the control center of a growing machine. Yet outside its walls, the world is not quiet. Neighboring kingdoms watch Assyria carefully. Some trade peacefully. Others grow nervous as Assyrian kings begin campaigning farther and farther from home. A small victory here, a tribute payment there. Piece by piece, Assyria's influence spreads across northern Mesopotamia. And the kings record every success in dramatic inscriptions. One ruler boasts of marching across distant lands and forcing foreign rulers to kneel before Ashur's power. Another describes collecting tribute: gold, silver, horses, exotic animals. Historians still argue whether these accounts reflect total domination or just temporary displays of strength. Ancient royal inscriptions tend to focus heavily on victories and mysteriously forget about setbacks. Funny how that works, but whether exaggerated or not, the reputation of Assyria is growing. Travelers carry stories across trade routes, stories of disciplined armies, stories of ambitious kings, stories of a people who believe their God has destined them to rule. And standing here in the busy streets of Ashur, watching merchants haggle while priests chant in distant temples and soldiers march past in steady formation, you can feel the early pulse of an empire that is preparing, slowly, methodically, to expand. The world beyond these walls doesn't quite realize it yet, but the city of Ashur is quietly preparing the engine of something enormous. And soon, that engine will start moving. The road out of Ashur is busy, long before sunrise. Ox carts creak under the weight of grain sacks, soldiers adjust leather straps on their armor, and somewhere nearby a trumpet, made from a curved horn, sounds a low note that vibrates through the morning air. You're standing at the edge of a transformation. because the Assyrians are about to change the way war works. Up to this point in ancient history, most armies are temporary. Kings gather farmers and townspeople when trouble appears, hand them weapons, and hope enthusiasm carries the day. After the battle, everyone goes home to harvest crops and complain about taxes. But the Assyrians start thinking differently. Instead of raising armies only during emergencies, they begin building something far more permanent, a standing military force trained year-round. One mainstream historical fact, often highlighted by historians, is that the Neo-Assyrian Empire, especially beginning in the reigns of rulers like Tiglath-Pileser III, develops one of the first professional armies in the ancient world. Soldiers receive consistent training, specialized roles, and increasingly standardized equipment. In short, the Assyrians start treating war like a full-time job, which means that while neighboring kingdoms are still gathering volunteers and hoping for the best, Assyrian troops are drilling in formation every week. You watch a group of infantry march past you now, rows of shield bearers carrying tall rectangular shields, followed by spearmen moving in coordinated steps. Officers walk along the sides correcting posture and spacing. It feels less like a tribal war band and more like a machine learning to move. And the Assyrians improve the machine piece by piece. Iron weapons begin appearing in larger numbers. Iron is harder and more durable than bronze. And although ironworking is still developing across the Near East, Assyria adopts it enthusiastically. You pick up a spear resting against a supply cart. The iron tip is narrow and sharp, designed to punch through armor. Not exactly the kind of souvenir you want falling from the sky during a battle. Nearby, a group of chariots rolls across the field. Each one is pulled by powerful horses and crewed by 2 or sometimes 3 men, one driver and 1 or 2 archers. The wheels kick up clouds of dust as they turn sharply. Chariots have existed for centuries by this point, but the Assyrians refine how they're used. Instead of treating them as occasional battlefield showpieces, they integrate chariots directly into coordinated battle plans. Infantry holds the line. Archers fire volleys from behind shields. Chariots maneuver along the flanks. And all of it happens under the direction of experienced officers. Historians still argue whether Assyrian military discipline truly exceeded that of all their neighbors, or whether surviving records simply emphasize it. After all, most of what we know about Assyrian warfare comes from Assyrian sources themselves. And ancient kings were not exactly neutral sports commentators. Still, archaeological evidence suggests their armies really were highly organized. Supply wagons carry food and spare weapons. Engineers travel with the troops. Messengers ride between units delivering orders. This logistical structure is one of the hidden secrets behind Assyria's success. Armies can only march as far as their supplies allow, and the Assyrians get very good at planning long campaigns. A quirky historical detail shows just how serious they are about logistics. Clay tablets discovered in Assyrian administrative centers record things like horse rations, weapon inventories, and travel routes. In some cases, officials even calculate how many days' worth of barley must accompany an army. Someone, somewhere, is always doing math. Probably the least glamorous job in the empire. You imagine a tired logistics officer muttering while counting sacks of grain. Great, another campaign. I hope the king remembers armies also eat. But for the Assyrian kings, expansion is becoming irresistible, rulers like Tiglath-Pileser I earlier had already campaigned widely, boasting of victories across the Near East. Centuries later, reformers like Tiglath-Pileser III will push the system even further, reorganizing the military and turning it into the unstoppable engine historians often describe. And with this engine comes a new level of ambition. Assyrian kings no longer think in terms of defending territory. They think in terms of domination. Campaign season begins almost every year. When the spring weather allows armies to travel, the king and his troops march out to remind neighboring regions exactly who is in charge. Some kingdoms pay tribute without resistance, others try to fight. If you happen to be a farmer living in one of those unlucky border states, seeing the Assyrian army approach must feel like watching a storm cloud roll across the horizon, dark, disciplined, and impossible to ignore. One detail you notice while walking among the soldiers is the diversity of equipment and clothing. Some troops carry long bows, others hold slings or axes. Cavalry units, yes, actual mounted riders, are beginning to appear more frequently. This is another important development. While chariots dominate earlier warfare, the Assyrians increasingly experiment with cavalry forces. Riding horses directly into battle allows greater mobility across rough terrain. Historians debate exactly when cavalry fully replaces chariots as the primary mobile unit, but Assyria plays a crucial role in developing mounted warfare. Watching these riders gallop across the training field, you can see the future of ancient combat beginning to take shape. And the empire's enemies are noticing too. Stories spread quickly along trade routes, stories of iron weapons, stories of disciplined armies marching hundreds of miles, stories of kings who never seem satisfied with the borders they already control. You overhear a merchant speaking quietly with another traveler near the road. They say the Assyrians defeated 3 cities last year, the merchant whispers. The traveler nods uneasily. And they're marching again this spring. That reputation, half fear, half awe, is becoming one of Assyria's most powerful weapons. Because sometimes the most effective victory is the one where your enemy surrenders before the battle even begins. And the Assyrians are learning how to cultivate that fear. The soldiers around you continue training under the rising sun. Spears flash in coordinated drills. Horses snort impatiently as riders tighten their grips on leather reins. The army is ready. The king is ambitious. And somewhere beyond the horizon, another kingdom is about to discover what happens when the Assyrian war machine finally starts moving. The army begins moving before dawn, and you find yourself walking alongside a column that seems to stretch endlessly across the dusty plain. The air is cool for now, though the rising sun promises another brutally warm day. Armor clinks softly. Horses snort. Hundreds, no, thousands of footsteps press into the dry earth. This is what the Assyrian war machine looks like in motion, and it's impressively organized. You might imagine ancient armies as chaotic mobs charging across fields, but the Assyrians operate with something closer to military choreography. Infantry units march in tight formations. Archers travel with bundles of arrows tied neatly to supply carts. Engineers move with specialized equipment strapped to wagons. Someone even thought to bring spare wheel parts for the chariots, which, if you've ever had a flat tire in the middle of nowhere, you know is the kind of planning that saves entire days of frustration. The army advances along a well-known route toward a rebellious city that has stopped paying tribute. Rebellion is something Assyrian kings take very personally. When a province refuses tribute, it's not just a financial issue. It's a challenge to the authority of the king, and by extension, the god Asher. So naturally, the response tends to be enthusiastic. One widely accepted historical fact is that the Assyrians build and maintain extensive road systems across their empire. These roads allow armies and messengers to travel quickly between distant regions. Royal couriers can carry orders across hundreds of kilometers in surprisingly short periods of time. You might call it the ancient version of priority shipping, except instead of delivering packages, it's delivering marching orders and occasionally entire armies. As the column moves, you notice scouts riding ahead on horseback, scanning the horizon. Communication between units happens constantly. Horn signals, hand gestures, shouted commands. The discipline is remarkable. Historians often emphasize that the Assyrians are among the first to combine multiple military specialties into coordinated operations. Infantry, archers, cavalry, and chariots work together rather than acting as separate groups. It's an early version of what modern historians call combined arms warfare. Basically, everyone has a job, and everyone does it at the same time. By midday, the army reaches a ridge overlooking the target city. Below you lies a walled settlement surrounded by farmland and irrigation canals. The walls aren't enormous, but they are solid. Thick mud brick, reinforced with stone in key areas. Watchtowers rise above the gates, and you can already see defenders gathering along the parapets. They know what's coming. Word travels fast when an Assyrian army is marching in your direction. And here is where the empire's reputation truly starts to matter. Because sometimes cities surrender immediately, they send envoys carrying tribute, gold, livestock, maybe even hostages, to show loyalty. But this city decides to resist. Which means you're about to witness one of the things the Assyrians become famous for: siege warfare. Sieges are slow, exhausting, and incredibly technical. Assyrian engineers immediately get to work. Teams of laborers begin building ramps out of packed earth and stone. Others assemble large wooden frames that will soon become siege towers. If you expected ancient warfare to involve a lot of random yelling and heroic sword fights, well, there will definitely be yelling. But there's also a surprising amount of construction. You watch workers carry baskets of dirt while overseers shout instructions. Piece by piece, the siege ramp begins rising towards the city wall. Meanwhile, archers position themselves behind protective shields called mantlets, large wooden barriers designed to block incoming arrows. It's like a very dangerous version of moving furniture, except the furniture shoots back. A quirky historical detail comes from relief carvings found in the palace of Sennacherib centuries later. These stone panels show Assyrian sieges in astonishing detail. Soldiers climbing ladders, engineers pushing battering rams, and defenders throwing stones from above. One panel even shows soldiers using what appears to be a primitive form of protective roofing over the battering ram to shield it from fire. Basically, the ancient equivalent of bringing an umbrella to a rock fight. Historians still argue whether these reliefs represent completely accurate depictions of real battles or partly staged propaganda scenes meant to glorify Assyrian power. Either way, They demonstrate the importance Assyrians place on siegecraft, because most cities in the ancient Near East rely on walls for protection. And if you can break the walls, you can break the city. The siege engines roll forward. One massive battering ram, suspended within a wooden frame, begins swinging rhythmically against the gate. Each impact sends a dull boom echoing across the fields. Boom, boom, boom. From the walls above, defenders fire arrows and drop stones. Assyrian archers respond with volleys of their own, creating a deadly exchange across the ramparts. Dust fills the air. Commands echo through the chaos. Yet despite the noise and tension, the Assyrian soldiers continue their work with almost mechanical focus. They've trained for this moment. They know exactly where to stand, when to advance, when to pull back. That consistency is part of what makes them so formidable. As the hours pass, cracks begin appearing in the city gate. The repeated impacts from the battering ram slowly weaken the structure. You hear splintering wood, then a louder crack. The defenders on the walls shout urgently, trying to reinforce the gate from inside. But the damage is already done. Another strike lands. The gate collapses inward with a heavy crash. And suddenly the army surges forward. Dust, shouting, and the thunder of boots fill the air as Assyrian soldiers pour through the opening. Chariots circle outside the walls, while infantry rushes into the streets beyond. The battle inside the city will be chaotic and frightening, but from the Assyrian perspective, the objective is clear. Take the city, end the rebellion, send a message. Because every victory like this strengthens the reputation spreading across the Near East. That resisting Assyria is not only dangerous, it's probably a very bad idea. And as the sun lowers towards the horizon, the Assyrian war machine prepares to demonstrate exactly why. By the time the dust begins settling, the city is no longer a place of resistance. It's a lesson. You stand just outside the shattered gate, watching Assyrian soldiers move through the streets with practiced efficiency. The chaos of battle fades surprisingly quickly. Units regroup. Officers shout instructions. Guards are posted at key intersections. This is something historians often point out. Assyrian warfare doesn't end when the walls fall. In many ways, that's when the real message begins. Because conquering a city is one thing. Making sure the next 10 cities surrender without a fight, that's something else entirely. And the Assyrians become masters of that strategy. One mainstream historical fact appears again and again in royal inscriptions. Assyrian kings deliberately publicize their victories in dramatic detail. They carve accounts into stone slabs, palace walls, and clay tablets describing exactly what happens to rebellious cities. And those descriptions are intense. But remember, this is where we keep things PG-13. So instead of graphic detail, imagine the king's scribes carefully recording punishments meant to demonstrate absolute authority. The idea is simple. If word spreads about what happens to rebels, fewer cities will want to test Assyrian patience. Psychological warfare, thousands of years before the phrase even exists. You can almost picture the royal propaganda team sitting around planning the announcement. Should we describe the victory? Yes. And the punishments? Absolutely. Maybe carve it into a giant wall so literally everyone can read it? Now you're thinking like an Assyrian. The inscriptions of kings such as Ashurnasirpal II are famous among historians for exactly this reason. His palace reliefs and texts describe campaigns across the Near East and the punishments inflicted on those who resisted. Historians still argue whether these descriptions reflect everyday reality or whether they were exaggerated to magnify the king's reputation. Ancient rulers often used dramatic language to intimidate enemies. After all, fear travels faster than armies, and fear is cheaper than fighting. But even if the accounts contain exaggeration, archaeological evidence suggests the Assyrians did practice harsh reprisals against rebellious cities, because their empire depends on obedience. If one province rebels successfully, others might follow. But if rebellion consistently ends badly, most cities will choose the safer option, sending tribute. So the Assyrian kings cultivate a very specific reputation. Not just powerful, terrifying. You notice something else happening in the conquered city now. Assyrian officials begin cataloging supplies, grain stores, livestock, valuable metals. Nothing goes uncounted. The empire doesn't simply destroy resources, it absorbs them. Administrators walk through storehouses marking inventories on clay tablets. Skilled craftsmen are identified and sometimes relocated to other parts of the empire, where their talents can benefit Assyrian projects. It's organized exploitation, which sounds harsh, because it is. But it's also part of what allows the empire to grow so rapidly. A quirky historical tidbit reveals that Assyrian kings sometimes bring exotic animals back from their campaigns. Lions, monkeys, even elephants in rare cases. These animals appear in palace reliefs, showing royal hunts or displays of imperial power. Imagine being a citizen of Ashur, watching a caravan arrive carrying a monkey from some distant jungle. You'd probably think the empire has reached the edges of the world. And in many ways, the Assyrians themselves begin believing exactly that. As more campaigns succeed, the kings grow increasingly confident that the god Ashur supports their expansion. Victories are interpreted as proof of divine approval, which conveniently means the next campaign must also be divinely approved. It's a very motivating cycle. Outside the city walls, the army prepares to move again. Soldiers repair damaged equipment, while supply officers redistribute food and water. Horses are watered at nearby canals. Even after a siege and battle, the army doesn't stay long. Campaign season is short, and there are always more cities to visit. You walk along the ridge overlooking the fields as the sun sets. Smoke drifts lazily into the evening sky from cooking fires and damaged buildings. Somewhere inside the city, new Assyrian officials are already organizing governance, appointing local administrators, or installing loyal governors. This is another key part of Assyrian strategy. They don't simply raid and leave, they incorporate. Regions become provinces, tribute systems are established, roads and communication lines connect new territories to the imperial center. Little by little, the map of the Near East begins changing. Historians still debate exactly how much local autonomy these provinces retain. Some areas seem to maintain their traditions under Assyrian supervision, while others experience stronger direct control. But the overall result is clear. The empire is expanding. From northern Mesopotamia outward into Syria, Anatolia, and eventually beyond. Each campaign pushes the borders farther. Each victory strengthens the empire's reputation. And each story carried by merchants and travelers spreads the same warning across distant lands. If the Assyrians come, in Chainsak, it's better to open your gates. Because somewhere along the road ahead, another city is hearing those rumors right now. Maybe its leaders are debating whether to resist or surrender. Maybe they're standing on their walls, scanning the horizon, hoping the stories are exaggerated. But you've walked with the army long enough to know something they're just beginning to realize. The Assyrian war machine doesn't march randomly. It marches deliberately. And once it starts moving in your direction, it rarely stops. The stories begin traveling faster than the army itself. Merchants whisper them at roadside markets. Caravan drivers repeat them around campfires beneath cold desert stars. Sailors carry them along river ports and coastal cities. Stories about the Assyrians. Stories about what happens when you refuse tribute. By the time you arrive at the next settlement along the empire's frontier, the rumors have already arrived days earlier. The city gates remain open, but the mood feels uneasy. Guards stand in nervous clusters, and the local ruler, somewhere inside a palace of mud brick and cedar beams, is almost certainly discussing a difficult question with his advisors. Do you resist, or do you surrender before the Assyrian army even arrives? This is exactly the situation Assyrian kings want to create. Because conquering a city through siege is expensive, it takes time, manpower, and supplies. But if a city opens its gates voluntarily and agrees to pay tribute, well, that's the perfect outcome. Fear, as it turns out, is one of the most efficient tools of empire. And Assyrian rulers know it. One of the most famous examples comes from the campaigns of Ashur-nasir-pal II, whose inscriptions proudly describe victories across Mesopotamia and the Levant. His palace at Kalhu, modern-day Nimrud, is covered with relief carvings showing long processions of tribute and defeated enemies. These carvings aren't subtle. You see soldiers marching in neat rows, prisoners being led away, and ambassadors from distant lands presenting gifts, gold bowls, fine textiles, exotic animals. It's imperial advertising carved into stone. Anyone visiting the palace would immediately understand the message. This king is powerful, and resistance is not recommended. Historians still argue whether the extreme punishments described in Assyrian texts were carried out as frequently as the inscriptions claim. Some scholars believe the kings exaggerated these acts to amplify their terrifying reputation. After all, if people believe the worst will happen, they're more likely to surrender peacefully. But there's little doubt that Assyrian warfare is deliberately intimidating, and that intimidation becomes a core strategy. You notice something fascinating while traveling with the army now. Along the roads and near conquered cities, large carved stone panels sometimes stand like ancient billboards. These inscriptions recount the king's victories, naming defeated rulers and listing tribute taken from conquered lands. It's the ancient version of a victory tweet, except carved into a rock that will last for centuries. King so-and-so defeated these cities, conquered these lands, and received tribute from these rulers. Signed, the universe's most confident monarch. But behind the dramatic language lies a practical political system. Once a region submits to Assyrian authority, it usually becomes either a vassal state or a full province of the empire. Vassal states keep their local kings, but must send tribute regularly, things like silver, horses, grain, and sometimes soldiers. In return, the Assyrians offer protection from other enemies. Provinces, on the other hand, fall under direct Assyrian administration, Governors appointed by the king oversee taxation, law enforcement, and military recruitment. This administrative structure helps Assyria control a surprisingly large territory. And as you walk through newly conquered lands, you start noticing something else. The empire is becoming multicultural. Prisoners taken from one region may be relocated to another. Skilled craftsmen from distant cities are moved to imperial capitals, where their talents can benefit royal building projects. Historians estimate that the Assyrians relocated hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, of people across their empire over several centuries. It's one of the earliest large-scale population transfer systems in history. A quirky detail appears in some administrative records, showing how carefully these relocations were organized. Officials track the movement of families, livestock, and equipment from one region to another. Imagine being told one day that you and your neighbors are moving hundreds of kilometers to start a new life somewhere else. No packing apps, no GPS, just an imperial decree and a very long walk. From the Assyrian perspective, however, this system has several advantages. Moving populations reduces the chance of local rebellions and spreads useful skills across the empire. If a region becomes unstable, its people might simply be relocated elsewhere. Efficient, though not exactly convenient for the people involved. Back on the road, the army continues marching through fertile valleys and dry hills. Supply wagons creak behind the infantry. Messengers ride ahead carrying news of victories and orders from the king. And everywhere the soldiers go, the reputation follows them. Cities begin surrendering before the army even arrives. Envoys ride out carrying tribute, gold rings, carved ivory, fine horses. In some places, entire delegations kneel before the king, pledging loyalty to Ashur and the Assyrian crown. For the moment, the system works beautifully. The empire grows larger. Tribute flows steadily into Assyrian treasuries, and the kings commission magnificent new buildings in their capitals to celebrate their success. But even as the empire expands, a quiet question lingers in the background. Historians still debate it today. Is an empire built on fear sustainable forever? Because fear can enforce obedience, but it can also plant resentment. Somewhere beyond the horizon, distant kingdoms are watching carefully. They see the Assyrian armies marching. They hear the stories carved into stone. And while some rulers choose to submit, others begin wondering if there might come a day when the great empire finally stretches itself too far. For now, though, the Assyrian war machine keeps moving forward, and across the ancient world, the message remains unmistakably clear. Resist if you dare. But remember what happened to the last city that tried. As the empire spreads across valleys, deserts, and distant riverlands, something unusual begins happening behind the scenes of Assyrian power. The army conquers cities, but the empire moves people. You're walking along a long caravan route now, and at first glance it looks like a normal trade convoy. Donkeys carry bundles of supplies. Ox carts rumble along slowly. Guards walk alongside with spears and shields. But the people traveling here are not merchants. They are families, hundreds of them, men, women, children, entire communities, moving together across the dusty landscape under the supervision of Assyrian officials. Some carry tools, others hold clay pots or small bundles of clothing. A few led goats or sheep. This is one of the most distinctive policies of the Assyrian Empire, mass deportation. One widely accepted historical fact is that Assyrian rulers systematically relocated conquered populations throughout their territories. Archaeologists and historians studying Assyrian administrative tablets estimate that hundreds of thousands, possibly even over 1 million, people were moved during the empire's height. It sounds enormous, and it was. But from the Assyrian perspective, it solved several problems at once. First, relocating people helped prevent rebellion. If a city revolted and its inhabitants were scattered across distant provinces, it became much harder for them to organize another uprising. Second, it allowed the empire to redistribute labor and skills. Skilled craftsmen from one region could be moved to another city where their abilities were needed. Third, it strengthened the empire's infrastructure. Newly settled populations could help cultivate farmland, construct canals, or work on royal building projects. In other words, the Assyrians weren't just conquering territory. They were reshaping the human geography of the entire Near East. You walk beside the caravan for a while. The guards maintain order, but the journey itself looks slow and exhausting. Dust sticks to clothing. Children ride in carts when they get too tired to walk. It's a long road to a new life you didn't exactly volunteer for. Historians often point to the deportation policy of kings like Tiglath-Pileser III as a turning point in Assyrian administration. During his reign in the 8th century BCE, the system becomes far more systematic and widespread. He reorganizes conquered territories into provinces and relocates populations on a scale earlier rulers had rarely attempted. Historians still argue whether these relocations were always brutal, forced marches, or whether some communities were allowed time to prepare and move more gradually. The evidence suggests both situations probably occurred. But either way, the message remains clear. The empire decides where people live. And when you control population movement, you control the structure of society itself. Interestingly, some deported groups eventually thrive in their new homes. Records show relocated communities becoming productive farmers, craftsmen, and merchants within the empire. Over time, the Assyrian world becomes incredibly diverse. Languages mix, traditions blend, trade routes grow busier. You might hear Aramaic spoken in one marketplace, Akkadian in another. Travelers bring music, clothing styles, and foods from distant regions. In a strange way, the Assyrian Empire becomes one of the earliest examples of a large, multicultural state. Of course, being moved across the empire probably feels less like cultural exchange and more like imperial relocation paperwork. Imagine waking up one morning to hear an official announcement. Congratulations, you're moving 600 kilometers east. Not exactly the travel experience you planned. A quirky historical tidbit appears in several Assyrian relief carvings showing long lines of deportees traveling with wagons full of belongings. Some panels even depict musicians and animals moving with the groups, which suggests that when entire communities relocated, they sometimes brought elements of their culture with them: music, crafts, religious practices. In other words, even empires can't completely erase local identity. Back in the imperial capitals, these population transfers fuel massive building projects. Cities like Nineveh, Kalhu, and Dur-Sharukin expand rapidly with new workers arriving from conquered territories. Palaces grow larger. Walls stretch farther. Canals and roads improve transportation across the empire. and the Assyrian kings proudly display these achievements. One ruler famous for such grand construction is Sargon II, who builds an entirely new capital city called Dur-Sharrukin. Imagine founding an entire city, basically, because you want a fresh administrative center, and maybe a palace that makes everyone else jealous. Historians still debate exactly why Sargon II decided to build this new capital from scratch. Some believe it was a political move to strengthen royal authority, while others think it may have reflected personal ambition or strategic planning. Either way, thousands of workers, many of them relocated from conquered regions, help transform empty land into a bustling city. The empire is literally building itself. But as impressive as this system looks from the center, it creates tension at the edges. Every deportation leaves behind resentment somewhere. Every relocated community remembers the homeland it lost. And across the vast territories of the empire, people quietly adapt while also quietly remembering. For now, though, the system works. The empire grows stronger. Cities flourish. Roads connect distant provinces. And caravans like the one you're walking beside continue their slow journey across the Assyrian world, carrying people toward new lives arranged by imperial decree. But history has a habit of keeping score. And somewhere in the distant future, the consequences of ruling through fear, conquest, and forced movement will begin to add up. For the moment, though, the empire stands at the height of its power. And from the perspective of the ancient world, Assyria looks unstoppable. As the empire stretches across mountains, deserts, and river valleys, the center of power gradually shifts from the old city of Ashur to something far grander. You arrive at one of the great capitals of the Assyrian world. The road widens, traffic increases, caravans from distant lands crowd the gates, carrying timber from Lebanon, metals from Anatolia, fine textiles from Syria, and spices whose scents drift softly through the warm air. Ahead of you rises the city of Nineveh. Its walls are enormous, thick, high, and stretching for kilometers across the landscape. Towers rise at intervals, like silent guardians watching the plains beyond. Massive gates, decorated with carved stone reliefs, allow caravans, soldiers, and travelers to enter the city in steady streams. One widely accepted historical fact is that Sennacherib transforms Nineveh into one of the largest and most magnificent cities of the ancient world during the 7th century BCE. The king invests enormous resources into expanding the city, building canals, gardens, temples, and enormous palaces. Walking through the gates, you quickly realize this is not just a military capital. It's a thriving urban center. Markets overflow with goods from every corner of the empire. Merchants shout prices in several languages. Potters display rows of glazed ceramics, shimmering in shades of blue and green. Metalworkers hammer bronze and iron into tools, weapons, and jewelry. The empire's power may come from war, but its wealth comes from trade and administration. You wander through a busy market square where traders from distant regions bargain over horses and fine cloth. Somewhere nearby, a baker pulls flatbread from a clay oven, and the smell instantly makes you hungry. Even in the most fearsome empire of antiquity, people still need lunch. The city itself is an engineering marvel. Sennacherib famously constructs an enormous network of canals to bring fresh water into Nineveh from distant hills. These canals irrigate farmland and supply water to the city's gardens and fountains. Some historians even believe the king may have built elaborate terraced gardens inside the city. Lush green spaces watered by complex irrigation systems. Historians still argue whether these gardens might have inspired later stories about the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The traditional story places those gardens in Babylon, but some scholars think the famous description may actually reflect Sennacherib's gardens at Nineveh instead. Ancient history occasionally plays a little game of mistaken addresses. Imagine building one of the wonders of the world, and then centuries later, everyone credits your rival city instead. You'd probably want a refund on the irrigation system. Inside the city walls, the royal palace dominates the skyline. Its entrance is guarded by massive statues, known as lamassu, human-headed winged bulls carved from enormous blocks of stone. Each statue stands several meters tall, combining the strength of a bull, the wings of a bird, and the intelligent face of a human. They look both majestic and slightly intimidating, which is exactly the point. Passing between these guardians feels like entering a place where power lives permanently. Inside the palace complex, corridors stretch through dozens of rooms decorated with carved stone panels. These reliefs depict royal hunts, battles, and long processions of tribute. You notice a scene showing the king hunting lions from a chariot, one of the most famous images of Assyrian royal art. Lion hunting becomes a powerful symbol of kingship. The king demonstrates his bravery and control over nature by facing one of the most dangerous animals known in the ancient world. Although, to be fair, the lion is often released into an arena where the king is surrounded by soldiers, so it's less like a surprise encounter and more like a carefully managed wildlife demonstration. Still, it certainly looks impressive in stone carvings. Meanwhile, deep inside the palace complex, scribes and administrators work constantly to manage the empire. Clay tablets pile up in storerooms, recording everything from tax payments to military logistics. Messages arrive from distant provinces reporting harvests, rebellions, or diplomatic negotiations. The empire is simply too large to manage without enormous bureaucratic effort. And this brings you to one of the most remarkable features of the Assyrian capital, a library. Not just a small collection of texts, but an enormous archive of knowledge assembled under the rule of Ashurbanipal, one of the last great Assyrian kings. Ashurbanipal is unusual among ancient rulers because he proudly claims to be literate and highly educated. He collects thousands of clay tablets from across Mesopotamia, preserving myths, scientific texts, medical knowledge, and ancient literature. Among these tablets is the famous Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest known works of literature in human history. In other words, while the Assyrians are famous for their armies, they are also quietly preserving the intellectual heritage of earlier civilizations. A quirky historical detail reveals that some tablets in Ashurbanipal's library include detailed instructions for interpreting dreams and omens. Apparently, ancient scholars took sleep analysis very seriously. Last night I dreamed about a goat standing on a roof. Interesting. That probably means good harvests or mild political instability. Ancient dream interpretation was a thriving academic field. Walking through the quiet tablet rooms, you realize something slightly ironic. The empire known for terror and conquest is also one of the greatest preservers of knowledge in the ancient world. Historians still debate whether Ashurbanipal's library was primarily a research center, a royal archive, or a display of intellectual prestige. Perhaps it was all three, but whatever the purpose, the collection will one day become incredibly valuable because long after the Assyrian Empire disappears, these clay tablets will survive, buried beneath the ruins of Nineveh, waiting for archaeologists thousands of years later. For now, though, the city is alive. Markets buzz with trade. Scribes record the empire's endless paperwork. Soldiers patrol the streets. And from the palace terraces, the king looks out across the capital of the most powerful empire the ancient Near East has ever seen. Yet even here, beneath the towering walls of Nineveh, small signs of trouble are beginning to appear on the horizon. Because when an empire grows this large, the number of enemies grows just as quickly. You step deeper into the palace complex of Nineveh, where the noise of the markets fades behind thick mud brick walls and long stone corridors. The air here is cooler, shaded by high ceilings and heavy wooden doors. Servants move quietly. Scribes whisper over clay tablets. Somewhere in the distance, a fountain trickles softly into a carved basin. This part of the palace feels less like a fortress and more like the headquarters of a very serious research institute. Because here, inside these quiet rooms, one of the greatest collections of ancient knowledge is slowly taking shape. The project belongs to Ashurbanipal, the powerful Assyrian king who rules during the 7th century BCE. Unlike many rulers who proudly display military strength but leave the reading to someone else, Ashurbanipal takes personal pride in being educated. He even boasts in inscriptions that he can read complex cuneiform texts, something that normally requires years of training. Basically, this king is the ancient equivalent of someone who both runs the company and still reads the technical manuals, and he's very proud of it. One mainstream historical fact that scholars often highlight is that Ashurbanipal orders scribes across the empire to collect texts from temples, libraries, and administrative centers. These tablets are copied and stored in the royal archives of Nineveh. Over time, the collection grows to more than 30,000 clay tablets. Imagine walking into a room where shelf after shelf contains stories, scientific observations, prayers, and royal records written over thousands of years. This is not just an archive. It's a time capsule of Mesopotamian civilization. You pick up one tablet carefully. The wedge-shaped symbols pressed into the clay record a story that is already ancient by Assyrian times. The Epic of Gilgamesh. It tells the story of the legendary king of Uruk, searching for immortality, traveling across dangerous lands, and learning difficult truths about human life. In a strange way, the Assyrian Empire, so famous for war and conquest, is also responsible for preserving one of humanity's oldest philosophical stories. Without Ashurbanipal's library, large parts of Mesopotamian literature might have vanished forever. Historians still argue whether the king collected these texts purely out of intellectual curiosity or whether the library also served a political purpose. Possessing ancient knowledge could strengthen royal authority by connecting Assyria to the long traditions of earlier civilizations like Sumer and Babylon. In other words, knowledge can also be propaganda. Look how wise our empire is, the king might say. Also, please ignore the army outside. Still, the scholars working here take their tasks very seriously. Scribes copy tablets with incredible precision. One small mistake in a sign could change the meaning of an entire passage. Clay tablets must be shaped, dried, sometimes baked, and carefully stored. And since clay tablets are not exactly lightweight, organizing this library probably requires very strong shelves. A quirky historical detail appears in some of the catalog tablets used by the librarians. Yes, catalog tablets. Even 4,000 years ago, librarians are organizing collections. Some tablets list the titles or opening lines of other texts, helping scribes locate specific works among the thousands stored in different rooms. Which means ancient librarians are already inventing the earliest versions of the card catalog. Somewhere in history, a tired Assyrian librarian probably sighs and mutters, "Why do we have 3 copies of this omen tablet?" Speaking of omens, a large portion of the library contains texts about divination, the interpretation of signs believed to reveal the will of the gods. Assyrian kings rely heavily on these predictions. Priests study the movements of stars, unusual animal behavior, weather patterns, and even dreams reported by royal officials. One series of tablets records thousands of possible omens based on astronomical events. If the moon appears red during a certain month, something important might happen. If a comet crosses the sky, the king should be cautious. Ancient astrology is extremely detailed and extremely confident. Imagine waking up to a royal announcement like this. Good news, the stars say today is excellent for diplomacy. Bad news, tomorrow might involve an invasion. But beyond omens and myths, the library also contains practical knowledge, medical texts describing treatments for illness, mathematical tablets used for calculations, and administrative records documenting the empire's daily operations. This mixture of science, religion, and bureaucracy reflects the complex world the Assyrians are managing. An empire this large cannot function without information. Messages arrive constantly from distant provinces. Reports of harvest yields, troop movements, diplomatic contacts. The scribes in Nineveh become the empire's information processors. In some ways, they are the ancient equivalent of data analysts, except their spreadsheets are made of clay. Outside the palace walls, life in the capital continues at full speed. Merchants trade goods from Egypt, Anatolia, and beyond. Construction crews expand temples and canals. Soldiers drill in training fields outside the city gates. Assyria still looks powerful. But historians studying this period notice something interesting. Even while Ashurbanipal strengthens the empire's intellectual prestige, the political situation beyond the capital is becoming more unstable. Rival powers are rising. The Babylonians to the south remain proud and difficult to control. In the east, new groups like the Medes are growing stronger. Historians still argue whether Ashurbanipal's long campaigns against these rivals weakened Assyria's resources or whether the empire was already facing internal problems. Either way, the signs of strain are slowly appearing. For now, though, the library continues growing. Scribes shape fresh clay tablets. Ancient stories are copied carefully. And inside these quiet archive rooms, knowledge from thousands of years of Mesopotamian civilization is preserved, waiting patiently for future generations who will one day dig these tablets out of the ruins of Nineveh, long after the Assyrian armies stop marching. Long after the empire itself disappears, the words written here will remain. Beyond the quiet halls of Ashurbanipal's library, The world outside the Assyrian Empire is beginning to shift in ways that even the most confident kings cannot fully control. You leave the cool stone corridors of the palace and step back into the sunlit streets of Nineveh. The city still hums with life, markets crowded with traders, soldiers marching between gates, scribes carrying stacks of clay tablets across courtyards. From inside these massive walls, the empire looks stable, powerful, permanent. But history rarely stays still. Far to the south, along the great rivers of Mesopotamia, lies a city that has always had a complicated relationship with Assyria, Babylon. The Babylonians share language, religion, and long cultural traditions with the Assyrians, yet they fiercely guard their independence. Over centuries, the two powers alternate between uneasy cooperation and open conflict. Babylon is not just another province. It's a city with deep historical prestige, home to ancient temples, powerful priesthoods, and proud citizens who remember a time when Babylon itself dominated Mesopotamia. Being ruled by Assyria does not sit comfortably with them. And from time to time, rebellions break out. Assyrian kings often respond harshly. Some rulers destroy parts of the city. Others rebuild it later, trying to balance punishment with political necessity. Historians still argue about the motivations behind these cycles of destruction and restoration. Some scholars believe Assyrian kings genuinely respected Babylon's cultural importance, while others think the repeated rebuilding was simply practical. Babylon remained too valuable to abandon. Either way, the relationship stays tense. Meanwhile, far to the east beyond the Zagros Mountains, another power is quietly growing: the Medes. The Medes are not yet a unified empire, but they are forming stronger alliances among their tribes. They control rugged highlands and strategic mountain passes, and their influence across the Iranian plateau gradually expands. At first, the Assyrians treat them as just another group of distant tribes. But over time, the Medes become more organized, more confident, and more aware of Assyria's vulnerabilities. You overhear traders in a Nineveh marketplace discussing these developments. They say the Medes are building larger armies now, one merchant murmurs. Another shrugs. Everyone builds armies eventually. That casual comment carries a quiet truth. Because Assyria has spent centuries fighting wars across the Near East, it has also taught many neighboring societies how powerful organized armies can be. When an empire dominates a region long enough, its enemies start learning from it. A quirky historical detail appears in some diplomatic letters preserved from this period. Assyrian kings regularly exchange messages with neighboring rulers, sometimes negotiating alliances or demanding tribute. One letter from a foreign king politely reminds the Assyrians that friendship works better than threats. You can almost hear the diplomatic translation: "Please stop conquering everyone." Back inside Nineveh, the royal court debates strategy. Advisors report on developments in distant provinces. Generals propose new campaigns. Priests examine omens before major decisions. And the king, still powerful, still confident, continues ruling over what appears to be the strongest empire in the world. But the geography of empire is becoming difficult to manage. From Egypt in the west to the mountains of Iran in the east, Assyria's territory stretches across enormous distances. Maintaining control requires constant attention. Armies must march frequently to suppress revolts. Governors must remain loyal. Supply lines must stay secure. And every new conquest adds another region that might eventually rebel. Historians often describe this stage as the peak of Assyrian power. Under kings like Ashurbanipal, the empire reaches its greatest territorial extent. But historians also debate whether this expansion creates hidden weaknesses. Because the larger an empire becomes, the harder it is to defend every border. You leave the capital city and travel along one of the imperial roads heading towards the frontier. The road itself is impressive, wide enough for carts and maintained by labor crews stationed along its length. Messengers ride past at high speed, carrying sealed tablets containing orders or intelligence reports. This communication network is one of Assyria's greatest administrative achievements. Yet even this system has limits. If rebellions erupt simultaneously in several regions, the empire must divide its forces. And while Assyria's army is powerful, it cannot be everywhere at once. In some distant provinces, resentment has been quietly growing for generations. Cities forced to pay tribute, communities relocated far from their homelands, local rulers replaced by Assyrian governors. For many subjects of the empire, obedience has been less about loyalty and more about fear. And fear can hold an empire together for a long time, but not forever. Historians still argue about the exact moment when the balance begins shifting against Assyria. Some believe the turning point comes after Ashurbanipal's later campaigns weaken the state's resources. Others think internal political struggles after his reign accelerate the empire's decline. What everyone agrees on is this: enemies are gathering. The Babylonians remain restless. The Medes grow stronger. And across the vast territories of the Assyrian world, people are beginning to wonder whether the empire that once seemed unstoppable might someday face a challenge it cannot crush. For now, though, the Assyrian banners still fly above the great walls of Nineveh. The army still marches. The kings still rule. But somewhere beyond the mountains and deserts surrounding the empire, the next chapter of this story is already beginning to unfold. The Assyrian Empire has reached a size that would make any ancient king feel unstoppable. From the hot plains of Mesopotamia to the forests of Anatolia, from the eastern mountains near Media to the distant lands touching Egypt, the empire stretches across thousands of kilometers. Roads connect cities, messengers ride day and night, governors rule provinces in the king's name. From the top of Nineveh's great walls, the world looks firmly under control. But empires don't just expand, they carry weight. And Assyria is beginning to feel it. You walk through a military encampment outside one of the western frontier cities. Rows of tents stretch across a dusty valley. Horses graze nearby while soldiers sharpen weapons beside small cooking fires. The army still looks disciplined, still looks powerful. But you start noticing something subtle: fatigue. Not in the sense that soldiers are collapsing from exhaustion, but in the sense that the empire requires constant war simply to maintain itself. A mainstream historical fact often emphasized by historians is that the Assyrian military campaigns occur almost every single year during the empire's height. Kings lead armies across vast distances to punish revolts, demand tribute, or expand the empire's borders. Victory after victory fills royal inscriptions. But every campaign costs resources. Weapons must be forged. Horses must be fed. Soldiers must be paid and supplied. And every conquered region requires administrators, garrisons, and infrastructure. The empire has become a machine that constantly needs fuel. You sit beside a supply wagon while workers unload sacks of barley meant for the army's horses. The officer supervising the delivery checks a clay tablet, listing quantities and destinations. Logistics never sleeps in an empire like this. A quirky historical tidbit from Assyrian records shows that entire departments existed just to track horse populations for the army. Horses were incredibly valuable military assets, especially for chariots and cavalry units. Officials kept detailed inventories, how many horses each province owed the crown, how many were available for campaigns, and how many had been lost. Imagine being the ancient equivalent of a horse accountant. Bad news, Your Majesty. We're short 12 horses and one very angry mule. Yet even with such organization, the system grows increasingly strained, because every time a province rebels, the empire must respond quickly. If one region successfully resists, others may try the same. You overhear soldiers discussing recent events while eating dinner around a small fire. Another revolt in Babylon, one mutters. The others nod. Rebellion in Babylon has almost become a regular headline by this point. The city's deep cultural pride and religious importance make it difficult to control for long periods. Sometimes Assyrian kings install loyal rulers. Other times, they rule the city directly. But stability rarely lasts forever. Historians still argue about whether Assyrian policy toward Babylon was too harsh or simply too inconsistent. Some rulers tried diplomacy and restoration projects, while others responded with destruction. The constant tension drained both sides. And Babylon wasn't the only trouble spot. In the distant west, controlling territories near Egypt proves challenging. Local kings sometimes shift loyalties, depending on which empire looks strongest at the moment. Meanwhile, in the eastern highlands, the Medes are becoming increasingly coordinated. At first, they appear in Assyrian records as scattered tribes. But gradually, they begin forming alliances and expanding their influence. And unlike many earlier enemies, they occupy mountainous terrain that makes large-scale invasions difficult. The empire is discovering something every large state eventually learns. Geography can be stubborn. You travel with a courier along one of the empire's long roads, heading toward a provincial capital where a governor awaits new instructions from Nineveh. The road itself remains impressive, maintained by labor crews, guarded at intervals by small garrisons. But even here, small signs of strain appear. Some villages along the route seem poorer than before. Farmers work fields that look thinner and drier than those near the empire's core regions. Decades of heavy taxation and forced labor have taken a toll. Historians debate how burdensome Assyrian tribute systems truly were. Some provinces appear to have prospered under imperial trade networks, while others struggled under repeated military demands. The truth probably varied from region to region, but resentment accumulates quietly. A farmer forced to deliver grain every year may obey, yet still remember. And when enough people remember, rebellions become easier to ignite. Back in Nineveh, the court still projects confidence. The king continues commissioning grand buildings and celebrating victories. But historians looking back across the centuries can see the pattern beginning to shift. The empire's greatest strength, its powerful army, is also becoming its greatest vulnerability. Because when your system relies on constant military pressure, any moment of weakness becomes dangerous. If one king dies unexpectedly, if two provinces revolt at once, if enemies begin cooperating instead of fighting each other, suddenly the unstoppable war machine must divide its attention. And divided attention is something even the strongest empire cannot sustain forever. You stand at the edge of a frontier fortress, watching the sun sink behind distant hills. Soldiers patrol the walls as usual. The banners of Assyria still snap proudly in the wind. From this vantage point, the empire still appears enormous and secure. But beyond those hills, in distant lands the Assyrians once dismissed as minor threats, new alliances are quietly forming. The Babylonians are watching. The Medes are gathering strength. And somewhere in the shadows of history, the moment is approaching when the empire that terrified the ancient world will finally face a challenge it cannot easily crush. For now, though, the Assyrian war machine keeps marching, because empires rarely realize their limits until they reach them. The first sparks of rebellion rarely look dramatic. They begin quietly. A tax shipment arrives late from a province. A governor sends a cautious message to Nineveh, reporting unusual unrest. A caravan route becomes slightly less secure than it used to be. Small cracks. From inside the Assyrian capital, these events seem manageable. After all, the empire has dealt with rebellions before. Send an army, replace a governor, carve a victory inscription, and the problem disappears. At least, that's how it has worked for generations. But now something different is happening. You travel south along the Euphrates River, where the fertile plains grow greener and the air becomes warmer. Villages cluster along irrigation canals. Date palms sway gently in the breeze. This is the heartland of southern Mesopotamia. And somewhere nearby lies the proud city of Babylon. Babylon has always been complicated for the Assyrians. Its temples are ancient, its priests influential, and its citizens deeply attached to their identity. Even when the city submits to Assyrian rule, the loyalty often feels temporary. Now the city is restless again. This time, however, the rebellion does not stand alone. A new leader emerges in Babylon, Nabopolassar. At first, he appears to be just another local rebel challenging Assyrian authority. But Nabopolassar proves something more dangerous. He is patient, strategic, and capable of building alliances. Instead of confronting Assyria directly in one desperate battle, he slowly strengthens his position. Cities across southern Mesopotamia begin supporting him. Governors sympathetic to Babylon's independence shift their loyalties. Trade routes quietly redirect resources towards the rebellion. Historians still argue about exactly how Nabopolassar managed to consolidate power so effectively. Some believe Assyria's internal political struggles weakened its ability to respond quickly. Others suggest Babylonian resentment had simply reached a breaking point. Either way, the rebellion gains momentum. Back in Nineveh, the royal court sends armies south to restore order. Assyrian troops are still powerful and well trained, and in several early battles they push the rebels back. But the conflict refuses to end quickly, because Nabopolassar has something the Assyrians rarely face: allies. Far to the east, beyond the Zagros Mountains, the Medes are also watching events closely. Their king, Cyaxares, has been uniting Median tribes and strengthening their military organization. For years, the Medes have fought the Assyrians along their eastern borders. Now they see an opportunity. Historians widely agree that the alliance between Babylon and Media becomes one of the decisive turning points in the fall of the Assyrian Empire. Two major regional powers coordinating against Assyria create a challenge unlike any the empire has faced before. Imagine two rivals suddenly realizing they share the same enemy. That realization changes everything. You walk through a military camp where Assyrian officers study maps drawn on clay tablets. Messengers arrive frequently, bringing reports from multiple fronts: rebellion in the south, Median raids in the east, unrest in several provinces. The empire that once marched outward with confidence is now reacting to threats coming from several directions. A quirky historical detail from Babylonian chronicles describes how Nabopolassar and the Medes sometimes coordinate campaigns based on seasonal conditions. Armies move when rivers are low enough to cross or when harvest seasons allow supplies to be gathered. Even ancient warfare requires good calendar management. Sorry, we can't invade this month. Harvest season. Despite these pressures, Assyria is still strong. Its armies remain experienced. Its fortresses remain formidable. Cities like Nineveh still stand behind massive walls. But the strategic situation has changed. Instead of crushing isolated revolts, the empire must now fight organized enemies working together. Historians still debate whether the Assyrians underestimated this alliance at first. After centuries of dominating their neighbors, the empire may have assumed its enemies would continue fighting each other rather than cooperating. That assumption proves costly. As the years pass, Babylonian forces steadily gain control of southern Mesopotamia. Assyrian garrisons retreat northward. Provinces once firmly loyal to Nineveh begin reconsidering their options. Because when an empire starts losing ground, its aura of invincibility fades quickly. You travel through a town that recently switched allegiance from Assyria to Babylon. The banners over the gate have changed, but the streets look almost the same. Life continues. Markets open. Farmers work their fields. Only the symbols of power have shifted. That's one of the strange realities of imperial collapse. For ordinary people, the biggest difference might simply be which king's name appears on official documents. But for the rulers of Assyria, the stakes are far greater. The empire they built through centuries of conquest is now under serious threat. Babylon grows stronger in the south. The Medes gather armies in the east. And across the Near East, cities that once trembled at the approach of Assyrian armies begin asking a question few dared whisper before. What if the empire can actually be defeated? For now, the final confrontation has not yet begun. But the stage is set. The alliances are forming. And the greatest war the Assyrian Empire will ever fight is slowly approaching. War now moves closer to the heart of the empire. You feel it in the tense silence of the roads, in the hurried pace of messengers galloping between cities, in the uneasy glances of officials reading reports from distant provinces. For centuries, Assyria has been the storm that crashes into other lands. Now the storm is turning back toward Assyria itself. In the south, Babylon is no longer just rebelling, it is rising. Under the leadership of Nabopolassar, the Babylonians gradually reclaim the cities that once belonged to them. Fortresses along the Euphrates fall one by one. At the same time, the eastern mountains grow restless. From beyond the Zagros, the armies of the Medes begin marching west under their king, Cyaxares. For generations, the Medes had been fragmented tribes, sometimes fighting each other as often as they fought Assyria. But Cyaxares reorganizes them into a more disciplined military force. A mainstream historical fact recorded in several ancient sources is that Cyaxares restructures the Median army into specialized units, archers, spearmen, and cavalry, making them far more effective in large-scale warfare. It is a military reform that suddenly makes the Medes a serious threat. You stand on a ridge overlooking a valley where two armies are preparing for battle. The banners are different now. Assyrian symbols on one side, Median emblems on the other. The clash that follows is fierce but strangely familiar. The Assyrians still fight with discipline, their shields locked together. Their archers release volleys in careful formation. Chariots surge forward with terrifying speed. But something has changed. The enemy is no longer frightened. Median warriors charge aggressively, their cavalry maneuvering across the field in ways Assyrian commanders did not expect. The battle turns into a brutal contest of endurance, rather than a quick demonstration of Assyrian superiority. And slowly, the Assyrians begin losing ground. Historians still argue whether the decisive turning point came from Median military improvements or from the sheer pressure of fighting multiple enemies at once. Most likely, it is both. While the Assyrian forces fight in the east, Babylonian armies continue pushing north along the great rivers. You travel through villages where the political winds are shifting again. Some towns quietly remove Assyrian symbols and replace them with Babylonian ones. Others simply wait, hoping not to attract attention from whichever army arrives next. Empires collapse unevenly. Some regions fall quickly. Others cling to the old order long after it is clearly fading. A quirky detail from ancient chronicles mentions that in certain towns, merchants continued stamping trade documents with Assyrian dates even after Babylonian forces had taken control, mostly because nobody had bothered to carve new administrative seals yet. Bureaucracy, it seems, collapses more slowly than armies. Meanwhile, the greatest prize in the empire looms ahead, the capital itself, the vast city of Nineveh. Nineveh is not just a city, it is a symbol of Assyrian power. Massive walls surround it, some rising more than 20 meters high. Towers guard the gates. Inside lie royal palaces, libraries, temples, and markets filled with goods from across the empire. At its height, Nineveh may have held more than 100,000 people. To the ancient world, it feels almost invincible. You walk along the top of the city walls as soldiers reinforce defenses. Workers stack extra stones near the battlements. Archers test their bows. Everyone knows the enemy is coming. Historians widely agree that by the late 7th century BCE, the combined forces of the Babylonians and Medes begin planning a full assault on Assyria's core territories. This is no longer a border war. This is the endgame. The Assyrian king at this time, Sin-sharish-kun, attempts to rally the empire's remaining strength. Armies are gathered, fortifications are reinforced. But the situation is grim. Decades of constant warfare have drained manpower. Many provinces have already rebelled or switched sides. enemies now approach from multiple directions. Historians still debate whether Assyria might have survived if the alliance between Babylon and Media had broken apart earlier. But that alliance holds. And together, their armies march toward Nineveh. You can almost hear them long before they arrive. Thousands of soldiers moving across plains and hills, wagons carrying supplies, horses snorting in the dust. The low thunder of a massive army, advancing steadily toward the empire's greatest city. Inside Nineveh, daily life continues with uneasy determination. Markets open, temples perform rituals, asking the gods for protection. Priests pray to Ashur, the divine patron of the Assyrian state, hoping the god who guided their conquests will now defend them. But outside the walls, history is moving forward, relentlessly. Soon the armies of Babylon and Media will surround the city. Soon the greatest capital of the ancient Near East will face the siege that decides the fate of an empire. And for the first time in centuries, the Assyrians themselves will stand on the defensive side of history. The armies arrive like a gathering storm. At first, you see dust rising along the horizon beyond the plains surrounding Nineveh. Then the shapes begin to form. Columns of soldiers, banners flapping in the wind, wagons creaking under the weight of supplies. The combined forces of Babylon and Media are here. Thousands upon thousands of warriors surround the greatest city of the Assyrian Empire. You stand atop Nineveh's immense walls, looking down at the approaching enemy. The defenders beside you tighten their grips on bows and spears. Armor clinks softly as soldiers shift their weight. The city still feels powerful. Massive stone walls stretch for kilometers. Towers rise at intervals like silent guardians. Deep moats and fortified gates make the capital one of the most formidable strongholds of the ancient world. A mainstream historical fact is that Nineveh's defensive walls were so enormous that ancient writers later described them as wide enough for multiple chariots to drive side by side. In other words, ancient urban planning with a bit of dramatic flair. Inside the city, people prepare for siege. Grain stores are counted. Wells are checked. Weapons are distributed to every able-bodied defender. The Assyrian king, Sin-shar-ish-kun, organizes the defense, determined to hold the capital against the coalition army. Historians still argue whether Sin-shar-ish-kun believed the city could truly survive the siege, or whether he simply had no other option left. Because abandoning Nineveh would mean abandoning the empire itself. Outside the walls, the attackers settle into position. The Babylonian forces under Nabopolassar coordinate with the Median army led by Cyaxares. Camps spread across the plains. Siege equipment begins appearing. Wooden towers battering rams, ramps built slowly from packed earth. The siege has begun. Days turn into weeks. You walk along the city streets where tension hangs in the air like summer heat. Markets still function, but voices are quieter. Families carry water jars and sacks of grain through narrow alleys. Children whisper questions their parents cannot fully answer. On the walls, soldiers watch the enemy constantly. Every morning begins with the sound of horns echoing across the battlefield as the attackers test the defenses. Arrows streak through the air. Stones crash against the walls. Defenders respond with volleys of their own. A quirky but fascinating detail from ancient warfare is that siege engineers often tried to undermine city walls by digging tunnels beneath them. The idea was simple: remove enough earth and the wall collapses under its own weight. Imagine digging a tunnel while knowing thousands of defenders are above you dropping rocks and fire down the shaft. Not exactly a relaxing work environment. Assyrian defenders counter these attempts by digging their own tunnels to intercept the attackers underground. Sometimes the tunnels meet unexpectedly, turning into chaotic underground fights lit only by torches. Ancient siege warfare occasionally resembles a very dangerous version of hide and seek. Meanwhile, inside Nineveh, the strain grows. Supplies begin shrinking faster than expected. The population of the city is enormous, and feeding tens of thousands of people during a siege is never easy. Historians debate exactly how long the siege lasted. Some estimates suggest several months during 612 BCE. But time is not on Assyria's side. Because the attackers keep adapting, the Babylonians and Medes bring more soldiers, more equipment, more determination. They know that if Nineveh falls, the empire itself will likely collapse. You climb one of the great towers at dusk and look across the battlefield. Fires burn in the enemy camps like a sea of orange lights. Drums echo faintly through the night. The coalition armies are not leaving. Another strange historical tidbit appears in later accounts of the siege. Some sources claim that unusually heavy rains caused parts of Nineveh's defensive walls to weaken or collapse. Historians still argue whether this event actually occurred or if it became exaggerated over time. But the story is persistent. A sudden flood of the nearby river, undermining sections of the city's defenses. If true, nature itself may have played a role in the fall of the empire. Either way, the attackers eventually find a way in. One section of the defenses gives way. Suddenly the impossible has happened. Enemy troops pour through the breach. The defenders fight desperately in the streets. Arrows fly between buildings. Soldiers clash in narrow alleys where formations collapse into chaotic hand-to-hand combat. For centuries, Assyrian armies brought this kind of destruction to other cities. Now, Nineveh experiences it firsthand. Historians agree that the fall of Nineveh in 612 BCE becomes one of the most dramatic moments in ancient Near Eastern history. The capital of the mightiest empire of its time is overwhelmed. The Assyrian king, Sin-Sharishkun, disappears from the historical record during the destruction. Most scholars believe he died defending the city. The great palaces burn, statues topple. The empire that once terrified the world is collapsing in its own capital. And as flames rise into the night sky above Nineveh, the Assyrian Empire, after centuries of dominance, reaches its final, irreversible turning point. The fires of Nineveh burn for days. From miles away, the glow rises above the horizon like a second sunset that refuses to fade. Smoke drifts across the plains, where the armies of Babylon and Media once camped, now slowly moving through the shattered remains of the greatest city the Assyrian Empire ever built. You walk through streets that only weeks ago were filled with merchants, soldiers, scribes, and travelers from across the Near East. Now they are strangely quiet. Walls stand cracked and blackened. Wooden beams lie collapsed in tangled heaps. Here and there, small groups of survivors move cautiously through the ruins, gathering what little they can salvage from their homes. The fall of Nineveh in 612 BCE marks one of the most decisive moments in ancient history. A mainstream historical fact is that after the city's destruction, Assyria never truly recovers its former power. Some Assyrian forces attempt to regroup farther west for a few years, even receiving temporary support from Egypt. But the empire as a dominant force is finished. The coalition of Babylonians and Medes has broken its heart. Historians still argue about exactly how complete the destruction of Nineveh was. Archaeological evidence suggests parts of the city were burned heavily, while other areas may have survived longer than ancient texts imply. Ancient writers often describe total devastation, but reality may have been a little more complicated. Still, the empire itself cannot survive the loss of its capital. You pass the ruins of what was once one of the most remarkable collections of knowledge in the ancient world, the great library of Ashurbanipal. Clay tablets lie scattered among broken walls. Many of them contain stories, records, and myths copied by scribes over generations. Ironically, the fire that destroyed parts of the palace also baked some of the clay tablets harder, preserving them for thousands of years. A quirky twist of history. The destruction of the Assyrian capital accidentally helped protect some of the world's oldest literature. Among these texts is the famous Epic of Gilgamesh, a story that had already been ancient even to the Assyrians themselves. So while the empire falls, its stories quietly survive. Meanwhile, the victors begin reshaping the political map of the region. Nabopolassar strengthens the newly revived Babylonian Empire, establishing Babylon once again as a major center of power. To the east, the Medes under Cyaxares expand their influence across large portions of former Assyrian territory. Historians still debate how evenly these lands were divided between the two allies. Ancient sources give different accounts, and the exact borders remain uncertain. But one thing is clear: the Assyrian Empire, the power that once dominated the Near East through relentless military campaigns, has vanished with surprising speed. You stand on a hill overlooking the quiet ruins of Nineveh as the sun slowly rises over the Tigris River. It feels almost peaceful now. Birds circle above broken towers. Grass begins creeping into cracks between fallen stones. Nature is already starting the slow process of reclaiming the city. Empires rise loudly. They fall quietly. For centuries, the Assyrians built a reputation as one of the most feared powers of the ancient world. Their armies conquered vast lands. Their kings carved victories into stone, and their capital glittered with wealth from distant provinces. But power built entirely on constant expansion carries a hidden risk. Eventually, expansion stops. And when it does, the machinery of empire can begin to collapse under its own weight. Historians still argue about whether the Assyrian Empire fell primarily because of external enemies or internal exhaustion. Perhaps it was both. The Babylonians and Medes delivered the final blow, but the empire had already been stretched thin by centuries of warfare, administration, and resistance from conquered peoples. Standing here in the quiet morning light, it's hard to imagine the terror Assyrian armies once inspired across the ancient world. Now the city is only ruins. And history moves on. But before we fully drift away from this story, the pace slows, the wind softens, and the ancient world begins to fade gently into the distance. You take one last quiet walk through the broken streets. The fires are long gone now. The smoke has disappeared. Only scattered stones remain where great palaces once stood. The echoes of marching armies, the thunder of chariots, the proud proclamations of kings. they all dissolve into silence. Somewhere beneath the soil, clay tablets still sleep. Stories written by Assyrian scribes thousands of years ago wait patiently for future archaeologists to uncover them again. And when they do, those voices from the past will whisper tales of ambition, power, fear, and human resilience. Because even the cruelest empires were built by people who believed their world would last forever. You step away from the ruins as the morning sun climbs higher, warming the quiet plains where Nineveh once ruled the horizon. The wind carries only the soft rustle of grass now. No armies, no banners, no empire. Just the long, calm breath of history settling back into rest. And as the ancient world slowly fades into the distance, the story drifts gently to a close, leaving only quiet ruins beneath a peaceful sky